is going on, guys? Today I'm going to show you how to start from this, which is just a scratch blank level, and we're going to make this level right here. It's going to look gorgeous, it's going to look great. And so with that said, let's go ahead and let's get into it. All of the assets that I'm using I will link in the description, and I'm going to go over the material I'm using for the landscape real quick. So this is the landscape material, and what it is it's just a dirt and a grass texture with a landscape coordinate and a landscape layer blend. Later, we're going to add grass maps, but for now, we're just going to stick with that. So one of the most important parts of building a great level is a block out. And what this is using cubes and spheres and primitive shapes to shape the level and the architecture and the scene composition that you're going to have so that when you do have your assets, you can build them properly, easily, and you already have the overall architecture of the level built out. Right now I'm starting with pathways, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that the character is not going to be too big or too small for the pathway. So these cubes that I'm placing will represent the pathway where the player will walk and the points of interest in which they lead to. So right now I'm leading into a pathway that will have a waterfall and like a pond, and in your game you can have quests or whatever there. These cubes represent the rocks for the waterfall because we want to get the architectural shape out of the way. So when we're building the assets, we don't have that. That plane, it represents the water. But I want to add a second pathway, which leads into a small cave for this level as well. I don't want it to just be a single point of interest. So we're going to use two caves, one for the waterfall and one that you can walk into. Remember, using basic shapes helps with keeping the architecture in mind. So when you do have the assets such as the grass, the trees, the rock, etc., you don't have to start from a blank canvas. You can do this, you can just copy the block out. And to finish off the scene composition, I'm going to add some stuff in the background such as hills and mountains. Okay, so now we have our block out, so we can actually go in to start using actual assets. So we're going to use a landscape. I've gone ahead and made the material that I mentioned earlier. We're going to drag that in, and we're going to use that for the landscape material. Once we do this, it's going to show up as a black, shiny material like that on the landscape, so we'll have to set up paint layers. It's really simple. It's just a landscape layer coordinate, so it tiles properly, and two layer blends of a dirt and a grass texture. In your own landscape, you probably have more, but for the sake of the tutorial, that's all I needed. And we are going to go ahead and place the material in there. And then what we're going to do is we are going to make sure it's the right scale for the level, which it is. It fits our level very well. This is an important part of the block out, is it helps set the scale for your level. You don't want a landscape that's too big or too small. So let's go ahead and let's just create the landscape, and we'll get started on sculpting it around the pathway. Now the landscape comes in completely flat. We want to add some divots and some hills to it with the pathway. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. We're going to shape the pathway or the landscape around the pathway that we made in the block out. Okay, so now we need to tell our landscape which textures to use from the material. So we're going to create a white blended layer on both of them, and we're going to give them a folder. We're going to create another white blended layer for the dirt, and then it's going to give our landscape a texture now. So it will be all grass. I want to do dirt. So we're going to make the path built out of the landscape just using a texture. If you're in 5.4, you can also use displacement and stuff like that. But for the sake of this, we're not going to use displacement. We're just going to use a diffuse texture. Go ahead and paint all the areas wherever I want the path to be, because this is going to replace those cubes that we placed, okay? So make sure this fits perfectly along the line. Make sure that the brush size is the proper size. I'll sped the rest of the process up for the video. Okay, but my landscape material is too shiny, so I'm going to roughen it up with a 0.8 parameter on the roughness scale for each of the textures. And so now we're going to use the flatten, sculpt, and smooth tool to ensure that the landscape fits our pathway. Because we already shaped it out in the block out, and now we need to add it to the actual assets with the terrain. So now we're going to use the landscape grass output node inside the landscape material so that we can spawn grass procedurally all across the map. Landscape layer sample node, it's named that. And what you'll do is you will give it the name of the sample or the layer of the landscape that you're going to use. So in this case, I name my layer grass. That's the texture, that's the layer with the grass texture on it. So we're going to spawn foliage on the grass. But in order to do that, we need to create a grass map asset, so landscape grass asset. So if we go to the foliage under the context menu and we search for landscape grass type, we can then create an asset that will spawn grass for us. So we'll give this the name of GM grass for grass map grass. So the landscape grass actor, it will have a option for adding array elements, and in this you'll add meshes to it. I'm adding in some grass, some bushes, and some flowers from an asset pack. I'll link the asset pack in the description for you. And we're going to set the density of each object inside the grass to fit the spawn rate. 400 is quite high, 50 would be kind of more accurate. You'll have to play around with these values as you use it. And now if we go back to our landscape material, we can set the grass map under the landscape grass output under the grass sample. So once we do this, the grass should spawn after we click apply. And your landscape should now look like this. It should have a bunch of foliage all around it, spawn throughout the entire thing. So let's go ahead and start setting up the pond and the waterfall. So we're gonna make sure that dirt is the only texture here because we don't want grass underneath water. Grass is not spawned underwater, so we got to pay attention to the details. We'll make sure all areas are painted with dirt so it feels natural. And now we're going to use a plane for the water. Okay. So we'll go back to the selection mode and we will add a plane and we'll scale this up. We'll fit this in the correct spot to fill the dirt void. I've sped up this process for the video. And then once you add a water material, which I'll link in the description, the one I'm using, you'll want to sculpt in so it's deeper. And we'll use the sculpt and then the flatten tool so it's the same depth so we don't have holes and stuff and spikes in our terrain. And I sped up the process again here. So now what we need to do is we need to sculpt the bank around the pond so that way it feels more natural. And once you sculpted the bank, you want to make sure it has the right texture. Now we want to give the bank small detail. So what we're going to do is we're going to add rocks around it, both small and large, using the foliage painter and manual placement. You can also use PCG if you have that tool in your disposal. So now that the pond is set up, we're going to go ahead and set up a waterfall. And I recommend using some randomization in the orientation of the rock so that it looks more natural because rocks don't look perfect. They are imperfect, which makes them look good. We don't want the player walking through here, so we're going to add a rock in the back that will cover the hole. And now I have a waterfall asset that I have placed from the marketplace in here. It's called Dr. Games Waterfall. And we're going to just scale this up to look more the size of the rock. However, we have a detail problem. We have a waterfall that's coming out with nothing behind it. So we're going to build a uphill um, river that will flow into the back of the waterfall to create the waterfall itself. And in the back, you can put a pond or whatnot in there, like a lake in the back over here. But that's up to you. I'm not going to put anything back there because we're not going to go back there as the player. And for the river, we'll sculpt around it just like we did the pond so that it looks more natural because you don't want a clipping water mesh. That looks really bad. And the tools I'm using in the landscape editor are sculpt, flatten, and smooth. And you kind of just got to go over it with trial and error. So now your environment should look like this if you have done everything correctly. We're going to build the secondary point of interest, which is the small cave. So we're going to create two little rocks and we're going to scale them up. We're going to give them a slight orientation offset and we're just going to build a wall around the path. And that will be a cave. And when you go into it, it'll look more natural. And then we're going to give it a ceiling, which is just a scaled up rock again, doing that same thing. And we're going to go in and we're going to delete all the little blockout cubes that we had because we don't need them anymore. We're getting kind of close to done, so we're going to go ahead and create the background scene composition. So I'm going to put some mountains here back where these cubes were represented. You could put a pond here or like a lake or an ocean or something so the river flows into that. But I'm not going to do that for this tutorial. So we'll just place a bunch of rocks. Remember, for rocks, you want to make them look organic. So you want to and so now we're going to start placing trees around the pathway where we want the player to be. So we're going to just dot some of these around here, around the path only. And we're going to use a specific tree around the path so it signifies this is a area you can walk. Okay, because we're going to use different trees in the background. But these trees signify that. And I'm kind of just scattering these around, seeing what looks good. You might have to do trial and error with your level to figure out, which placement looks good of trees, which does not. Okay, so we have our main area, so we're going to go ahead and build out the background forest. So I want to put a place of forest because I don't want the player going through here or anything like that. So we're going to place a big dense forest, and we're just going to use different trees that we used from the pathway so that the player knows, hey, this isn't a good spot, you can't walk here. And that leaves a problem where the terrain is flat where the forest is, so we're going to sculpt hills and mountains around here with the terrain editor. You'll have to use the sculpt, the smooth, and maybe the flatten tool to make it look good. And you'll have to use hard smoothing to make it look even better. And as a small detail, I want to add some trees around the riverbank of the river that goes into the waterfall so that when players see it, it looks more natural. It's not just a flat river with nothing around it, okay? And now we can go in and we can delete our block out pathway because we don't need it anymore. We have built our pathway and we're going to start working on the final touches, which is post-processing, lighting, and fog. But we can go ahead and delete that. I'm going to speed this up to finish it off. There's one final touch I just noticed, and that's where we start as the player. There is a empty patch there, and it doesn't look natural. So we're gonna put a rock there to signify why it starts there. Okay, so our environment's done. We need to add post-processing now. I've found that adding a little bit of color with some contrast and some saturation helps. I found turning the gain down just a little bit helps as well. We need to enable infinite extent unbound in order to see it. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to go into the settings on the camera, and I believe it's under local exposure. We're going to go down and we're going to look for sharpen. We're going to set that to 0 because we don't need that. And vignette, you can turn that on if you want. We want lens flares on for the visual effect. And for detail strength, I turn that to 1.4. It helps makes the image a little more clear. We're going to make the shadows a little bit more pronounced with the shadow. And then what we're also going to do is we're going to add fog. I'm just going to adjust the fog until it looks pretty good. And from there, I think that looks good. The final thing we're going to do is adjust the lighting, the angle of the lighting specifically. So we'll get the directional light and we'll rotate it until we find an angle where it looks really good. I'm going to rotate it down and then to the right or left, I believe. And that should get us a look that looks really, really good in my opinion. Environment is done. We have a workable level that looks good. We started from nothing and now we have this. If you like this video, hit the subscribe, hit the like. I have a Discord for support as well. Have a good one.